Picture this. You're tucking your daughter into bed, reading her the sweet story of Little Red Riding Hood. A brave little girl, a basket of goodies for grandma, and a big bad wolf who gets his comeuppance from a heroic woodsman. But what if I told you that the big bad wolf wasn't a metaphor at all? What if the original Little Red Riding Hood wasn't a children's story, but a survival manual written in blood? The fairy tales we think we know aren't fairy tales at all. They're medieval Amber Alert systems, documented warnings about real predators who stalked real children through real forests. Little Red Riding Hood wasn't about stranger danger in the abstract. It was about specific monsters who hunted specific victims using specific methods that parents desperately needed their children to understand. Between 1764 and 1767, something began systematically hunting the people of south-central France. It killed over 100 men, women, and children in the most brutal ways imaginable. The French called it La Bête de Gévaudan, the Beast of Gévaudan. But this wasn't folklore. It was documented, investigated, and reported across Europe, and its hunting patterns match the Little Red Riding Hood story so precisely that it's impossible to ignore the connection. You're about to discover that Little Red Riding Hood wasn't teaching children about metaphorical wolves. It was teaching them how to survive real ones. The basket of food, the forest path, the questions about where you're going. Every detail came from actual attack patterns that terrorized medieval Europe for centuries. The Brothers Grimm weren't collecting fairy tales. They were documenting survival strategies. Detailed examination of La Bête du Gévaudan, the documented creature that terrorized France from 1767. Eyewitness accounts describe a wolf-like creature, the size of a calf, with reddish fur, a broad chest, and jaws powerful enough to decapitate humans with one bite. Unlike normal wolves that kill for food, this creature hunted strategically, targeting lone travelers, especially women and children. Analysis of the beast's specific methodology: stalking victims for miles, waiting for complete isolation, attacking with surgical precision, targeting throat and head. Survivors described how it would stand on hind legs like a man, study prey before striking, and appear to enjoy the terror it caused. King Louis XV's response: sending his best hunters, offering massive rewards, making it international news. The attacks became so notorious that entire regions lived in terror, afraid to let children walk alone anywhere. Multiple documented attacks involved girls between 8 and 16 years old carrying baskets of food to relatives through forest paths. Specific case of Marie-Jean Vallet, age 19, who fought off the beast with a spear while carrying food to family, matching exactly the fairy tale scenario. Documentation of wolf attacks across medieval Europe for centuries. Church records from Germany, France, and Eastern Europe containing hundreds of accounts of wolves entering villages, dragging away children, terrorizing communities. Medieval parents used these tales as survival guides. Never trust strangers, never walk alone, always be suspicious of those asking too many questions about your destination. Examination of the original published version, far more graphic than Disney adaptations. The wolf tricks the girl into eating her grandmother's flesh and drinking her blood before devouring her alive. No heroic woodsman, no rescue, just death and consumption. Analysis of even earlier oral traditions collected by folklorists. These versions contained explicit warnings about specific predator behaviors, asking questions about destinations, following at a distance, using false familiarity to gain trust. How later sanitized versions removed the crucial survival lessons. Original versions functioned as medieval Amber Alert systems, teaching children to recognize predator grooming behaviors, escape techniques, and when to abandon politeness for survival. Documentation of similar wolf girl stories across medieval Europe, each adapted to local predator threats. German versions emphasized forest dangers. Scandinavian versions focused on isolation survival. Mediterranean versions warned about human traffickers disguised as helpful strangers. Historical records of children who died following the exact pattern described in early versions, isolated on forest paths, carrying food, targeted by predators who had studied their routines. Court records and church documents preserving their names and circumstances. How the heroic rescue ending was added centuries later to make the story more palatable for children, fundamentally changing it from a survival manual into entertainment and removing its effectiveness as a warning system. Historical records of human predators who operated exactly like the fairy tale wolf. Court documents, execution records, and church chronicles documenting men who stalked children on forest paths, used food as bait, asked questions about family routines and destinations. Specific case studies of traveling merchants who used legitimate business as cover for predatory behavior. These men would learn village routines, identify vulnerable children, then strike when they found isolated victims carrying valuable goods or food. Documentation of men who lived alone in forest cottages, surviving partially by preying on lost or abandoned children. Archaeological evidence of isolated dwellings with evidence of multiple child victims, matching the grandmother's house scenario. How medieval communities tried to protect children, travel rules, escort systems, coded warnings, embedded in stories and songs. The fairy tale functioned as part of this protection network, teaching children to recognize danger signs that adults couldn't always explain directly. Court records showing how difficult it was to prosecute child predators in medieval times. Wealth, social position, and mobility allowed many predators to operate with impunity, making community-based warning systems like fairy tales crucial for child survival. Analysis of documented cases showing how predators used the same psychological manipulation described in fairy tales: false kindness, feigned concern, gradual trust building, then isolation and attack. The fairy tale served as a catalogue of these techniques, teaching children to recognize and resist them. Analysis of how the fairy tale encoded specific survival strategies: staying on paths, avoiding questions from strangers, trusting instincts about danger, seeking help from legitimate authorities rather than isolated individuals. How oral traditions preserved crucial safety information across generations. Communities that maintained these warning stories had documented lower rates of child disappearances, suggesting the tales functioned as effective protection systems. How 20th century sanitization removed all survival value from the story. Modern versions teach children to trust authority figures and expect rescue, rather than developing personal survival skills and threat recognition. Parallels between medieval predator behaviors and modern child predators. How the original fairy tales' warnings about grooming, isolation, and manipulation remain relevant today, but have been stripped from contemporary versions. Brief examination of how other fairy tales functioned similarly. Hansel and Gretel warning about starvation cannibals, Snow White about family betrayal, Cinderella about economic exploitation. These weren't entertainment, but survival manuals for dangerous times. What we've lost by transforming warning systems into entertainment. The original Little Red Riding Hood taught children that the world contained real dangers, requiring real caution, that adults couldn't always protect them, and that survival sometimes meant abandoning social politeness for self-preservation. Little Red Riding Hood wasn't a fairy tale. It was a documented response to documented threats. The wolf was real, the victims were real, and the warnings were literally matters of life and death. When we tell our children sanitized versions today, we're not just changing a story, we're dismantling a survival system that protected children for centuries. The Brothers Grimm weren't collecting entertainment, they were preserving evidence.